Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When you put the words Imperial and Fanatic in the same sentence, you generally think of hardened stormtrooper units who continued fighting against the New Republic long after the death of Emperor Palpatine. Or perhaps one's mind hovers towards the pilots of the 204th Imperial Fighter Wing, with their feared TIE fighters carrying out revenge attacks against civilian targets. These groups are seen as fanatics because of their dedication to the Empire, and their willingness to sacrifice everything, even their own lives, to make sure that the mission is successful. But if you guys were to ask me, Alan, what type of Imperial do you think is the most fanatic? I would have a oddly very specific answer for you, and that is the captain of a Gozanti Class Cruiser. No, seriously. Let me explain. Corellian Engineering Corporation had a lot of audacity to label the Gazanti a cruiser in the first place. Cruisers are supposed to be fast-moving vessels that are larger than destroyers, but less heavily armed than a battleship. The Gazanti, at just 63.8 meters in length, is most definitely not very large. It's also not that fast. If there is one thing that the Gazanti gets right about that cruiser designation, is that this ship is definitely less heavily armed than a battleship. As a matter of fact, if you start removing some of that gray Durasteel deck plating, you'll find that this so-called Imperial class Gazanti Class Cruiser shares 99% of the same internal components as the civilian version of the Gazanti Class Cruiser that CEC builds for the civilian and commercial markets. Now, of course, the Empire would like its young officers to think that no, this is definitely a purpose-built warship, but what the Gazanti class actually was just a glorified, up-armed commercial freighter. It just happened to have some Imperial Navy badges slapped onto it. And so this Gazanti Class Cruiser is not some modern state-of-the-art battle tank. It's more like a second-hand Toyota Tacoma that you bought from a plumber that is now being used for fire support missions and regime change somewhere in Libya. The widespread adoption of the Gazanti Class Cruiser is an admission by the Empire that they just didn't have the resources to guard the entire galaxy, especially in the Outer Rim, where civilization grows increasingly spread out and sparse. The concentration of resources into something as large as an Imperial-class Star Destroyer might make sense in the core regions of the galaxy. But when the average threat in the Outer Rim consists of a few bandits flying modified freighters and starfighters around, sometimes all you really need is your own modified freighter and starfighters to meet them. And let me tell you something about the average captain of a Gazanti Class Cruiser. There is a serious edge to them that you won't see in other bridge officers and much larger classes of ships in the Empire. Do you guys remember in the second season of The Mandalorian when Din Djarin meets up with Bo-Katan for the first time? Lady Katan was still in exile, and she and some of her Night Owls were scoping out an Imperial-class Gazanti Class Cruiser parked on the world of Trask. The Mandos wanted to board the ship and take it over. Whatever weapons and supplies they could find on the vessel would be used to help the Mandalorians retake their former homeworld. Din Djarin and the Night Owls make a fearsome assault squad. Heavily armored in Beskar, this gives the attackers a huge advantage in the narrow corridors of a ship. Now, before these Mandalorians make it to the bridge, the captain of the ship manages to connect with Moff Gideon, an ISB agent who is also in charge of this specific Imperial Remnant faction. Here's how this exchange goes.
How far have they gotten?
They've breached the cargo hold and taken everything but the bridge. We require immediate backup.
If they've taken that much of the ship, I'm afraid that's no longer an option.
You see, Moff Gideon wasn't your typical Imperial warlord. He was actually a lot more ambitious and a lot worse in a lot of ways. The thought of his ship falling into the hands of the Mandalorians that he so despised was unthinkable. And so instead of telling the captain to lay down his weapons and save his own life, he says this. After killing the pilots, the captain would take control of the ship and try to slam it into the ocean so that no one could get their hands on all of these weapons. But Din Djarin and the Mandalorians managed to reach the cockpit just in time to stop him. The Imperial captain had already fulfilled his duty. He had tried his best to keep the ship out of Mandalorian hands and had failed. Instead of giving up, though, he has one last surprise: a shocker capsule hidden inside of his tooth. Not all that different from those infamous cyanide capsules that spies supposedly used during the Cold War, although pretty sure that was just a myth, because I imagine you wouldn't want your, high-valued operatives to accidentally chew down on a pistachio shell and kill themselves, right? Then we have our second incident with a Gazanti Class Cruiser captain named Pierce. This one takes place just a year after the rise of the Empire. Captain Pierce's ship is transporting fugitive clones who have turned against the Empire. When his Gozanti Class Cruiser is intercepted by a shuttle full of rogue clone troopers, the TK stormtroopers and clone commandos that form the security detachment on board are quickly overwhelmed. Captain Pierce is the last Imperial standing and is held at gunpoint. The rogue clones want to know where all these clones are being processed, and with the memory banks wiped on the ship, Captain Pierce was the last person left with that knowledge.
Well, I guess we'll have to get that intel out of you.
Here we go again, another captain of a Gazanti Class Cruiser willing to throw his life away for basically nothing. What the hell is going on here? Do all these captains of these ships have some serious death wish? Are their families being held hostage by the Empire? I mean, why are they so willing to do this? How could these men be so fanatically loyal to an empire that famously mistreats and misuses their military personnel? Do they have inhibitor chips in their brains, or is it something scarier? A culture of blind loyalty and obedience that is so powerful that it'll override the most basic human instinct of trying to stay alive at all costs? Why sacrifice so much, especially as the captain of a glorified box truck that just happens to have armor and turbo lasers mounted onto it? I mean, this wasn't exactly a command to die for, or was it? Well, if you actually consider how large the Galactic Empire was and how concentrated wealth was just in the core regions of the galaxy, being the captain of a 63-meter long starship is actually a really good job. It was a job that was definitely better than 99% of jobs that existed. I mean, you have to remember that a significant portion of the galaxy lived outside of the traditional economic system, working as moisture farmers, bounty hunters, and scrappers, not to mention slaves. To have like a normal, stable job with healthcare and some benefits and maybe even a pension, that was a really big deal. I mean, it's even bigger deal than it is here on Earth, believe it or not. Especially in the aftermath of the Clone Wars, which led to the devastation of so many planets, especially in the Outer Rim. Palpatine's plan for rebuilding the galaxy involved massive government spending that would employ billions upon billions of Imperial citizens. This was a far cry from the Republic, which was more laissez-faire. I mean, they didn't even have a standing military or a Federal Reserve. The Empire's approach put the military before everything, even the political and economic order. And Palpatine wanted to not only replace the Grand Army of the Republic, but also scale up the size of the Imperial military. And this meant huge industrial contracts for more ships, weapons, uniforms, and everything else the military needs to fight. This meant huge amounts of recruitment. It meant lifting billions of people out of abject poverty, bringing them into the Imperial system where they could now have things that no one in their families could have ever dreamed of before them. Like shoes, or a bed in a permanent shelter, or something as simple as taking a trip to the stars. We have to remember that although there were worlds like Coruscant and Alderaan, which were highly advanced, in the peripherals of the galaxy, you still had really primitive and backwards worlds which were isolated from the rest of the galaxy for centuries, sometimes thousands of years. And it was on these worlds that where the citizens had the most to gain that the Empire would actually recruit the most loyal soldiers. Worlds long ignored by the Republic's market economy because of their lack of economic development were now attracting Imperial recruiters for that same reason. Centuries of underdevelopment and poverty made the citizens of these planets extremely grateful for the opportunities that the Empire would provide for them. And so while an 18-year-old on Coruscant would scoff at what the signing bonus was for the Imperial Army, an 18-year-old moisture farmer on Tatooine who has no way off of the planet might sign up for the Imperial Army without that bonus just to see the galaxy. Now, we don't really know how many people served in the Imperial military and also in the Imperial military complex, but it had to be massive, especially considering the scale of Palpatine's ambition and how much power he actually controlled. If you take a look at the only military-first dictatorship here on Earth, North Korea, it has a population of 26 million people, and it has roughly 2 million personnel for its military that involves both active and reserve personnel. That means out of every 100 North Koreans, 8 of those individuals are going to be soldiers. That's kind of nuts, especially if you consider that, militaries don't really produce much economic growth for a nation. What it does create, though, especially in the Empire, is a massive club that many members of society are a part of. It creates a sense that a lot of people that you know are in the Imperial military, and a lot of people seem to make a good career out of it. On top of that, the rapid growth of the Imperial military also meant that it destroyed a lot of different industries. The Imperial military and industrial complex consumed skilled workers and laborers from other industries at an alarming rate. And very quickly, for a lot of people, a job with the Empire was the only job in town. There's really no avoiding working with the Empire in some capacity on most worlds. And being an Imperial officer, well, that granted you a lot of social status and real political and financial power. See, most authoritarian regimes promise peace, stability, order, and a lack of corruption, but the reality is the personnel that dictators usually get rid of first, the bureaucrats, the technocrats, and the other experts who are supposed to watch over the various branches of government, are actually crucial for the day-to-day operations of the government. Yes, they're know-it-alls, and yes, they can be annoying, and yes, you might not understand what the heck it is that they do, but really, it's their job to prevent corruption. The rules and regulation they uphold are supposed to work the same for everyone, but when dictators rise to power, they generally like a separate set of rules for themselves and the people that support them. And so usually dictators purge these monitors who are supposed to be checks and balances. With this system broken down, what that means is the more remote an Imperial officer is, the further away they are from their own superior officers, the easier it is for them to carve out their own private fiefdom and monetize their officer's commission. Oh, you're supposed to be maintaining peace in that city? Well, why not start charging businesses for protection? Sure, it might be considered racketeering, but with no free media and Senate Overwatch committees to look over your shoulder, who the hell's gonna care? And while you're at it, why not tax all goods coming through the spaceport as well? I mean, clearly, your men aren't getting paid enough for patrolling this very dangerous backwater world. I mean, this happens everywhere in the world, everywhere in the galaxy. It doesn't matter what culture, or race, or religion, or language you speak. It's very much in human nature. It's not that some humans are more trustworthy than others. All humans, when given the chance to steal, exploit, and take more than their fair share, will find a way to justify it to themselves. And here's the thing about Imperial corruption. It was widely known, it was widely understood by the citizens of the Empire that corruption was rampant. And that is terrible for your government. And guess what happens when you're some poor villager and you see your hard-earned money get taxed by not only the local government, but also by the Empire, and then also by the local Imperial garrison commander as well? Well, you can either blow up that Imperial garrison, or better yet, just join the Empire and get an officer's commission, so you can take advantage of that corruption yourself. Okay, so we've established just what service in the Imperial military meant, especially for people who weren't born with a golden spoon in their mouth in the core worlds. How does a position as a captain for a Gozanti Class Cruiser play into all of this? Well, the Imperial military is very strict in defining the roles of each one of its service branches. You have the Imperial Army, then you have the Stormtrooper Corps, which technically is a part of the Imperial Army, and then you have the Imperial Navy. The Imperial Army was pretty easy to get into. Basically, they would take everyone who signed up. The Stormtrooper Corps was a bit more politically fanatic. They also had a culture not that different from the Marine Corps, which means as an organization, they had a warrior-like culture that actually looked forward to being tested in combat. And then you had the cushiest of all the branches, the Imperial Navy. This is where the smartest and brightest individuals in the Imperial Academy system get to go. And once you get onto that track, you have two further pathways you can take. You can either become a TIE fighter pilot, a very dangerous and high adrenaline position, or you can work your way into a bridge crew position, which eventually can lead to a command position. When you command a ship, you're not just commanding a bunch of soldiers going into battle. You're essentially running a small little military base that can move around. This includes being in charge of requisitions, oftentimes gathered from local sources. See, the Empire approves a budget for you to use, and then you have complete control of that budget because, Coruscant's not going to send some people to the Outer Rim to watch over your back. This allows you to have a bit of purchasing power, especially when dealing with local vendors. Perhaps you can suggest that you'll need some kickbacks in order for them to win a contract. This is how corruption works. And so the responsibilities of command here actually gives you a lot of power, which you can then leverage into a more political position within the Imperial Navy, which also leads to more power and credits. Basically, if you have the ambition to do more than just serve in the military, the Imperial Navy was the best place for you to go. As such, the Imperial Navy Academy system was full of second sons from royal families, heirs to large mega corporations, and of course, future politicians who were looking to make a name for themselves before they run for office. And to the Empire's credit, it was also full of highly skilled pilots who would have never had a shot to leave their home planets without the Imperial Navy system. Individuals like Han Solo or Sienna Ree, for instance. Now, you remember at the beginning of this video, I was calling out Corellian Engineering Corporation for labeling this ship as a cruiser. I was kind of making fun of the Gazanti. But from the viewpoint of your average Imperial cadet who's just graduated, the Gazanti Class Cruiser is actually seen as something completely different. A terrific opportunity. Let me redirect you guys to a passage from the recent Thrawn trilogy. It's a passage where Eli Vanto, that's Thrawn's aide, is basically talking about the Gozanti Class Cruiser and what makes it so special. They're a bit old. Most were of pre-Clone Wars manufacture, but they could still hold their own alongside newer ships. Most were being used as freighters or evac ships, but some were being retrofitted with external clamps to carry starfighters or walkers, which would bring them into the front lines against pirate smugglers and slavers. In any role though, a Gazanti was a good, solid ship from which to launch a career. You see, no one starts off in command of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. Those things are a mile long, and the amount of knowledge, experience, and political ass-kissing you need to do to be in control of one of these things is crazy. Basically like running a city. And as we mentioned before, when you're in command of a ship, there's a lot of kickbacks, and when you're in command of a ship that is the size of a city, you can make millions, if not billions, of credits in those kickbacks. These were very lucrative positions that Imperial captains would guard with their lives. Not just from rebels, but from other Imperial captains. Now, the Gazanti Class Cruiser was more of a beginner ship. For those individuals who had a lot of political connections or were really wealthy or who were really ambitious, this was just seen as the first step in a long career. But for those who had no connections, this is actually an amazing opportunity for an individual who probably had zero opportunity prior. The cutthroat nature of the Imperial military was the result of a culture of backstabbing and social climbing in the Empire that was most likely supported by Palpatine, which I find very alarming. You see, the further in towards the core you got, the crazier the Sith-like competition for power got. I mean, just take a look at the feud between Tarkin and Director Krennic, which ended up with Tarkin blowing up the director with the Death Star. I'm sure Palpatine was pleased by how Sith-like Tarkin had become. You see, the Gazanti Class Cruisers were deployed really far away from the drama of the core regions in the Outer Rim. And yes, some dumber Imperial officers might have seen this as a bad thing, to be far away from the political drama. Plus, there was very little wealth in the Outer Rim, which meant corruption yielded poor results, and there was also the risk of actually seeing combat in the Outer Rim, something that rarely happened in the core regions. But if you're smart like Eli Vanto, who we mentioned before, you'll realize the lack of political drama and well-connected officers in the Outer Rim gave opportunity to officers like him to rise up the ranks through merit alone. The fact that combat is almost guaranteed means that it's a great place for a young Imperial officer to prove their value. Funny enough, the Outer Rim reminds me a lot of the frontier regions of the Roman Empire. When Julius Caesar's first consulship ended, he had been defeated by his political enemies within the Senate in Rome. He was dejected, he had run out of political weapons and maneuvers to use against his enemies. Things were basically looking very grim. It's at this point that supposedly his wife gave him the advice to go seek his fortunes in the untamed borders of the Roman Empire, where instead of fighting politicians for limited power and gain in Rome, he could fight the Gauls and conquer territory and bring glory for all of Rome. And so the Imperial captains who sought challenge in the Outer Rim or had no choice but to seek challenge in the Outer Rim were a special bunch. They realized that their way of rising up through the ranks would not be done by political maneuvering, backstabbing, or using their connections, but through combat. What's more, this wasn't the usual type of combat that the Empire had trained its officers for, where they usually overwhelmed the enemy with their own numbers and had complete control over the battlefield. The captains of a Gazanti Class Cruiser in the Outer Rim oftentimes found themselves at parity with their enemies. Sometimes they were even outgunned. These captains had to be very tough, and they had to be quick learners. They had to be very flexible tacticians, otherwise they just wouldn't make it. These captains were oftentimes isolated from the rest of the Empire, making long patrol runs without seeing a friendly face for months at a time. And the Empire, like an abusive partner, grows even more desirable the longer you spend time away from it and actually realize how up it is. It's much easier for Imperials to hold on to a more romanticized version of what the Empire is when they don't actually see it around them on a daily basis, persecuting locals and stepping on their faces. And given the real horrors that the Empire fought in the Outer Rim, it only makes sense that the captains of these ships would be incredibly invested in their mission and incredibly proud of their work and loyal to their cause. And that's because in the Outer Rim, well, there are a lot more terrifying things than just the Empire.